on this computer. All right, welcome everybody. The for our penultimate session with the Crusades, and tonight we are talking. We started last week talking a little bit about the Third Crusade, but mostly we spent a fair bit of time on the second Crusade. Today we're covering the third and the fourth because timeline wise, they actually happen very close together. So that's part and parcel of how this unfolds. So in terms of where we have been, it's hard to believe we've already covered 4 weeks of this, and now we're on week five. And then next week, we'll be talking about the aftermath and the legacy of what the Crusades ultimately meant and how they're still being felt today. So that's for next week. Now, there were more sort of labeled crusades than the fourth crusade, and the Crusader period does continue right up until like the end of the Crusader period, depending on how you count it, either ends in 1291 or in 1492, depending upon on how you phrase it. So that's part of it. I mean, we can certainly have those chances to explore that. We'll talk about more of it this week. But one of the things about the Crusades that I want to put some emphasis on is just this. Are you familiar with the laws of diminishing returns? The idea is the more that you do something, the less effective it becomes with each successive attempt at it. It's not always true because I mean in the element of practice and things like that, you will practice does make perfect, but there are certain things, and this is one of them, where the more often something happens, the less effective it would become. And part of this was the First Crusade was unexpectedly successful. The fact that they actually got to Jerusalem uh, was in some respects the word that's on the tip of my tongue, but it's not actually really all that appropriate, is miracle. And the fact that they actually made it because I don't want to really assign any sort of divine favor to the Crusades itself, but people who were participating in it, particularly things like finding the so-called Spear of Destiny in Antioch, for example, there were sort of examples of that in the middle of it. Um, but the First Crusade, it was unexpectedly successful, but all the other campaigns, while they did meet with some success, none of them ever achieved the same degree of the military and political victories that the first one did. Just across the board, that just didn't happen. Um, and again, it was less about the prowess of the First Crusade. It was less about the prowess, the ability of the Crusaders who are coming through, and more about the weakness of these Islamic dynasties that were all competing with each other, and the Crusaders happened to step in at at an opportune time, but unexpectedly so. They didn't say, "Hey, they're weak. We're going to take advantage." They just kind of blundered into it, and it was sort of more by luck than anything else. So this is just reviewing what we covered last night. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, we have four. There were four so-called Crusader states that existed in some capacity for um, uh, the in peace relatively for about 50 years or so. You had the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem were all European-controlled states in the Middle East. The Principality of Armenian Sicilia was actually a vassal state to the Byzantine Empire. So they were independent in really a name only, but they were basically a client or a buffer state to the Byzantines that they had um, sworn oaths of fealty. The other thing is that the four Crusader states also had imported the feudal economic system into where they were, whereas the Byzantine Empire worked on a different principle, as did the Principality of Armenia and Sicilia. Uh, Collectively, these four states were known, again, reviewing as the Outremer, as the referred to as overseas. Um, and in the aftermath of the First Crusade, you saw what the Crusade, but the Byzantines themselves ended up controlling almost double what the territory they had at the beginning. So, from the Byzantine perspective, it was actually quite a success that they managed to get back almost all of what they had hoped to get back. But then they ended up this unexpected results because they did not expect the Crusaders to go all the way to Jerusalem. That's not what they asked for. But the Byzantines were very good at politics, negotiation, and the like, and so they had mostly recovered a lot of that background. So now I don't know if any of you can hear a cat wailing in the background, but there is a door closed right here, and the cat is offended by said closed door. Um, Ian, you don't need to add your own commentary. Okay. Um, so the one thing that you know, oddly enough, the creation of the Crusader states did actually relieve the pressure that was being put on the Byzantine Empire, because now the Seljuk Turks, who were now occupying this reduced area over here, or the Seljuk Sultanate, and the Seljuk Empire, well, which was over here. All of a sudden, you now had the Crusader states in and down through this area that were in. All of a sudden, you had this European power separate from the Byzantines that were actually taking pressure off of the Byzantine Empire. And so they were able to control and gain that. The Europeans, on the other hand, they established these Crusader states, and that opened up trade routes between here and Europe, but it also opened up trade routes that would actually continue even further east into other parts of deeper Asia eventually. That these, just the opening up of these trade routes and the taste of these trade routes, which is an important distinction, because even at a point at which the Crusader states eventually no longer had control in these areas, the interest in those goods from the points east became an incentive for trade. Already mentioned this part, the feudal hierarchy that was common in Western Europe was now involved here. But then, of course, in the aftermath of the roughly halfway through the 12th century, and what led up to the Second Crusade, was that the county of Edessa was basically all but lost. The Principality of Antioch came under full Byzantine control. Um, and the remaining Crusader states of Tripoli and the Kingdom of Jerusalem were reduced in size, and the Fatimid Caliphate began to take thing. Partly what happened here is that you had Islam now becoming unified, where at the beginning of the First Crusade, there were a bunch of different powers. They were all split. They were all in going in different directions, different goals, competing with each other. And that disunity came to an end with the rise in power of Salah ad-Din. I mean, his full name is there, Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Abu Ayyub. And he was a Kurdish Sunni Muslim. Oddly enough, um, had served in the Turkish Zengid army. When they say Zengid, that was the name of the warlord in the Seljuk Empire who controlled that. Um, but he was but the thing is, he had been established down in Egypt, and so he was far enough removed, and that he was able to claim power for himself in the Fatimid dynasty, because his uncle had lent some assistance, and then to various factions within the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt, of all places, and managed, through a bunch of political maneuvering, managed to gain control. And so, because he was able to do this, he was Sunni. The Fatimids were Shia Muslim, and he unified a number of the cities. The all in the areas around the Crusader states, and he basically founded his own dynasty, which became known as the Ayyubid dynasty. But Salahuddin was also quite interested in religious matters himself, and the and then in the various politicking, as he's consolidating his power, of course, his economics and forces eventually do come into contact, like he's there. Everybody's well aware of the Crusader states, but he starts moving against the Crusader states in these sea-based raids, because the Crusaders themselves, who had been allying themselves with other powers as well, and the raids themselves were basically pirate raids, that part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had access to the Red Sea, through what is now known as Aqaba, and which is right on the part of the Red Sea, but on the left side. I think I've got a map here. There we are, Aqaba down here, and that's just the top of the Red Sea there. That at one point the Kingdom of Jerusalem was all the way down here, and that threatened Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam. And so, in a response to protect that, that's one of the things that Salahuddin started to move against. And as you can see, he started consolidating his power first amongst the Islamic states, completely outside of here, moving through, claiming some territory from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, up through Damascus to Hama and Aleppo, consolidating a lot of his power against the Seljuk Turks, of which, oddly enough, he had been part of, but was able to unify them. And then in 1187, basically moved up the coast, claimed all sorts of territory, leaving the Crusaders with just the Kingdom of Jerusalem was reduced to this tiny point around Tyre. The county of Tripoli was reduced here. The Principality of Antioch, again, reduced in size, and of course Edessa had long since disappeared under the broad control of the Armenian, but really under the control of the Byzantines. And they had lost. It just came through in 1187, managed to retake Jerusalem. And so, in the Battle of Hattin, which was, if you actually saw the Ridley Scott's The Kingdom of Heaven, they allude to the Battle of Hattin. It happens off screen before the siege of Jerusalem, where a large number of Crusaders were basically it was a decisive defeat for the Crusader states, and it led to the eventual of um, fall of Jerusalem. And so, you know, Reynald, the um, uh, Reynald was captured and beheaded. Well, the king of Jerusalem was spared, but the Crusader forces themselves were depleted beyond the ability to fight anymore. And so, because Jerusalem was no longer be able to be defended, it fell quickly, along with most of the towns and villages. And again, in the end, only Antioch, Tripoli, and Tyre remained in European hands. And this would be a major psychological blow because remember, after the end of the First Crusade, nobody expected it to be that successful. And when the Crusaders went back successfully, it was highly romanticized in Western Europe. A lot of the legends of the noble knights, all of these kinds of things. It was spun as universal and wholly good. The results of the First Crusade. They didn't talk about the debacle that was the People's Crusade or the massacres in Jerusalem or anything like that. It was, you know, they confronted it, and God had delivered Jerusalem into their hands. And now here we have, nearly 100 years later, all of a sudden now Jerusalem is again back in Islamic hands, and the any of the European forces or the European states that existed in the Middle East were reduced to these just tiny little rump states. And that blow in Europe was tangible because all of a sudden this 90-year-old narrative is now gone. and so after in the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem in Hattin and Jerusalem in 1187, the it was said that the Pope collapsed and died upon hearing the news of Hattin. And then his successor, Gregory VIII, proclaimed that the fall of Jerusalem was God's punishment for the sins of Christians across Europe. So, Richard, this is going into this is where it's moving into almost clearly religious territory, even though the background behind it is very much an economic one. The Pope.
But as you said, though, John, with the first doing so well, not the people's part, but the actual first crusade,
Yes,
because it did so well out of basic stupidity was how they were able to get that done.
Yep.
It was just a lot of propaganda after that, was it
Oh
not?
yeah, it absolutely was.
I know you say it's fairy tale and it's whole 9 yards, but the reality is, in order to make it seem as if it was greater than it was just propaganda, and that sort of continued.
Mm-hmm.
So for it to get to the third crusade, and then the Pope go, well, it fell because they have to have somebody to blame,
Of course,
not that they have to take any responsibility.
Yeah.
So I'm right on that.
Oh, yeah, you're absolutely. I would agree with that assessment.
Oh, John, wow, thank you.
Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. That language, that propaganda language, I think is really important because the legends, myth making is part and parcel of is part and parcel of nation building, and we look at that in the language that we use here, that's when if myth making is about what makes us, what's our identity. I'm not talking about historical facts or not. It's what are the stories that we tell about ourselves, and all of a sudden this story that we told about ourselves, that by God's hand, we defeated the enemy. We freed Jerusalem, and all of a sudden, 90 years later, all that comes crashing down. And so, not surprisingly, making that theological assessment of it, Pope Gregory the Eighth, um, then you know that then he proclaims a crusade, another crusade to recapture the kingdom of Jerusalem, and that would be an act of repentance, or a penitent act to take this back. And so, in this case, this third crusade would directly involve several kings in Europe, like the heads of state of several things. And that included Frederick the First, who was the Holy Roman Emperor of the time, Philip the Second, who's the King of France, and for those of you from England and Richard, I'm not sure if this is where.
You need to be very careful how you touch that one.
Oh, I know. I absolutely do. But Richard the Lionheart was part of this. He actively did this. And I mean, some of the stories about for example, Robin Hood, is that there were all kinds of nefarious things going. Richard was seen as a kind and benevolent and competent king, but he went off to the Crusades. And all kinds of nefarious things were happening in his absence, and that's where some of the legends of Robin Hood came about. Um, so here's the thing: this little voice box here is that apparently Philip and Richard went on crusade together to keep an eye on each other, because politics in Europe were still divisive. They still fought with each other all the time. And the intent of the First Crusade was to try and stop getting them to fight each other and actually unify on something here. So even though this wasn't it, like the first one, it was the Pope's design, whereas this one was a mutual agreement that they trusted each other enough not to trust each other. Would be the best way to put it. And so they agreed, okay, we are going on a crusade together. And that way, you can, you can cover it. So,
How did they think that they would, how did they think that they would carve out any wins?
in the Third Crusade,
Yeah, like would
um,
they
well, the thing is,
beforehand have said, "Hey, look, I'll go in first and I'll take such and such. You can come in afterwards, and then we'll split it." Or
I
like,
well, we're going to get to that. Actually, Cheryl, we actually are going to cover that.
okay,
So, and we'll get to so. How they actually got there, and I'm borrowing something from the American Revolutionary War. One if by land, two if by sea. Just borrowing that phrase. That Frederick the First, he was about 70 years old at the beginning of the Third Crusade. Okay, 70 years old. The we classify 70 years old as in as senior citizen, but sort of a younger senior citizen. um this was in a time where the expected lifespan was quite a bit shorter than 70 years. So Frederick the First, he had been in the Second Crusade as a noble knight, so he had already been there, so that there was some experience with that. He kind of knew what was involved, and so he managed to assemble and set out by land to travel across Europe and down through Turkey, the largest Crusader army ever assembled, and approximately 100,000 troops, including 20,000 knights. Enormous. This was, if you think, it's more than double what the original the First Crusade had uh, at the start. Never mind what actually got there. And they moved this entire army overland, and unfortunately, by doing so, the Byzantine Emperor Isaac I wasn't too pleased about them moving through his territory. Because that is a lot of troops, and again, trust levels are not very high. these people, they may have been all Christians, but they did not trust each other. And so, oddly enough, Isaac the First had actually made an agreement with Saladin to impede the progress of the Holy Roman Emperor and his forces as they moved through it. There was an actual deal behind the scenes. And Frederick got wind of this. He captured Adrianople, and he said, "You know what? We'd only return the city if the Byzantine Emperor would transport his army into Asia Minor." Basically, he held a city hostage to do it. And with this enormous army in 1190, defeated the Seljuk army, but unfortunately, Frederick I himself drowned less than a month later. And whether he was just taking a casual swim and just whatever happened, but anyway, the king died, and unfortunately, that monster army was completely demoralized, and they just broke up, and only a small group of them eventually ended up joining the other two forces of Philip and Richard in Tyre. So, enormous potential, huge army, king dies, and just everybody breaks up. And unfortunately, that's a consequence of the feudal system of these oaths of loyalty. Once the person to whom they've sworn the fealty to is dead, those oaths go away, and they kind of choose their own paths. Let's go to Richard and Philip. So what they decided to do was to travel to, and when I say the Levant is basically the Eastern Mediterranean. And they resolved to travel by sea because they could, one, hopefully get there faster. Two, they are able to it becomes a little bit more efficient. You're not wearing out your troops or your horses or whatever just simply by traveling with them. And so Philip leaves Messina in Sicily in 1191, and Richard doesn't leave until April. Philip gets to Acre fairly uneventfully, but unfortunately, Richard's travels with his army were much more eventful. Apparently, fairly close to Cyprus, of course, weather prediction systems being virtually non-existent at the time. Richard's fleet gets hit with a massive storm. Several of the fleet get shipwrecked, and one of the ones that runs aground, for whatever reason, Richard's sister Joan and his fiance and a large amount of their cash reserves intended to finance the Crusades runs aground. And of course, the Byzantine Duke of Cyprus seized the treasure and took the women captive. And of course, Richard wasn't happy with this, but arrived with his forces, met with them, agreed. And at this point, Richard, marries his betrothed, and they at that point in time met with with Guy of Jerusalem, who had been the king, of Jerusalem, and so they met with him, trying to draw up plans of what they would do. So. And then once Isaac, the Duke who ruled Cyprus, orders Richard to leave, and of course Richard is there with an already well-armed force, and he simply says, "No, if you're not going to be hospitable to us, we are going to take this. We need an advanced base ourselves, and we are going to take this and keep this." So, and And eventually, Richard would then turn around and sell the entire island to the Knights Templar. We talked about their formation previously. And then the Templars, of course, hey, real estate is profitable. The Templars then turn around and sold it, and then in June would continue on to Acre in 1191. So unfortunately, I can't really zoom in on this, but in terms of the overall travel, you can see that Richard took a long route to travel all the way down eventually to Cyprus, and then they all rendezvoused in Acre. Um, and the uh, and then of course you have the Frederick, the travels of the forces of Frederick, but most of the forces that actually got to Tyre and to Acre um, had largely dissipated, even as large as that force was. Um, but they rallied in Tyre. They came to Acre, and Acre had been the part of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And they had been laying siege to it for almost 2 years at this point in time. The surviving Crusader forces they were trying to reclaim that, and it was a long siege. And they were able to resupply each other. It was an extended stalemate, of what's sometimes called a frozen conflict. And so there was the Crusader forces attacking. The Crusader forces cut off the city, but Salah ad-Din had largely prevented them from being resupplied by land, and so things were always coming in by ship. And it wasn't until the arrival of Leopold, Richard, and Philip that all of a sudden now you had a whole bunch of new forces coming in favor, and then things flipped in favor of the Crusaders. And so you have the relief forces but they kind of come in piecemeal. Leopold gets there first, leading the remaining forces that had started with Frederick the First. Then you have about roughly a month later, Philip arrives in April, and starts building these enormous siege engines, basically what are called trebuchets, which are I don't know if you've ever seen that. They're you may be familiar with catapults, which are sort of a wound spring. You put a rock on it, and it flings it this way. Whereas a trebuchet is more of a long-armed throwing mechanism that
like a
uses
slingshot.
a heavyweight. Yeah, it is sort of like a slingshot, and it's much heavier
Mhm.
than um, it is far heavier a um, a uh, a siege engine um, than uh, than even catapults would be. And then, of course, in June, so you have this kind of staggered arrival of these forces, each coming in with a certain degree of freshness when they arrive. And Richard, of course, amps up siege engine construction and just keeps this siege up. But also, the other thing about Richard in particular is that Richard was also he was a diplomat. He was a skilled warrior, but he was also a diplomat. He knew he was good at negotiating and good at negotiating deals, and had sought to meet with Salah ad-Din, but unfortunately, of course, one of the things that is often not realized, that one of the most crippling things in any military campaign is disease. Um, and unfortunately, both Richard and Philip themselves were found themselves ill. The meeting did not happen. And so, the siege continued. The engines themselves, they were effective in punching the holes in the city walls. Um, but each time that there was a danger of a breach, they would use some sort of signal, whether it was a flare or something like that. They would put up, and then Salah would see the signal, and that's when he was careful to use his forces to come in and to counterattack to prevent them from taking advantage of the breached wall, and so that they were able to then very quickly repair it. And so you had this cycle of breach, counterattack, repair going on and on and on until mid-July. But eventually, the forces in Acre were no longer able to hold off the Crusaders. And so the conditions of surrender at that point were negotiated, and the city surrendered on July 12th. And so after this, Leopold and Philip themselves would return home, and they left Richard in charge. And so Richard, he was a decent negotiator, but things didn't go quite as he had hoped. And so, while the Muslim garrison captured, they basically offered the soldiers in exchange for a ransom, and so apparently they had found the true cross artifact that Saladin had captured in 1187.
What was the true cross?
The true cross basically is sometimes a piece of wood reputed to be the cross that Jesus was crucified on.
Oh,
However, I think, Richard, you can probably state this, that apparently if you took all of the pieces reportedly from the true cross, you'd have enough to crucify an entire army.
Yes.
I'm correct on that?
There are so many actual relics, even down to the spear that John mentioned before, because if you can get enough people to believe it,
yeah,
then they will follow because of it.
Mhm.
yeah.
There is, I'm not sure if it's in Greece, they are reputed to have that actual piece of the cross, but it's on their altar and it's decorated with the most phenomenal jewels you have ever seen, embellished in such a magnificent way. But as you look at the back, all you see is technically a piece of wood with a hole in it that was supposed to be where the nail was. So it's amazing how they can take these symbols, because I don't believe that they're the actual pieces, and determine, yes, this is what this is, because they didn't have carbon dating. And even when they've done it now, they find that there's no way it could be
Mhm.
exactly what they say it is.
Yeah.
But if you have enough people believe it, that's all that's required.
Yeah. So anyway, Richard provides the deadline for what's there, and of course Saladin, did go about raising money, wanted to pay ransom for his soldiers, but he was also stalling for time in order to bring in reinforcements. He is trying to raise money, but he's also, if I can stall for long enough, maybe I can stall long enough that they can't do that. And so Salahadin provided the first of three agreed upon payments on August 11th, but he rejected it because there were several nobles that were not included. And I think one of the things that perhaps that the Islamic forces didn't understand the feudal structure, and that certain people were more valuable than others. Um, and so at this point in time, Richard orders that all 2,700 prisoners be taken out of the hill in full view of Saladin's army, and decapitates all of them. And this is the Crusader forces doing this. Um,
That doesn't sound very nice.
no, not at all. And it enraged Salahadin's forces, and they just in rage, they just this haphazard attack, and of course, not surprisingly, Salahadin's response was to kill all of the prisoners that he had. And so then all of a sudden you now have Caesarea, and basically Richard starts moving down the coast with resupplying from sea as he keeps going. The because Saladin's army is down there, but they were able to be resupplied along the whole way, and then they met at Arsuf, uh, the just north of Jaffa, and of course Saladin managed to hide his forces, and they did harassment strikes, but of course he placed his most disciplined troops as anchor points to make sure that his armies wouldn't. And Saladin tried to break them up, but Richard, of course, tried to hold it together. And the Knights Hospitaller themselves almost lost the script. But again, Richard was competent. He was a competent military commander. Um, and so he was able to rally the forces, order a counterattack, and surprisingly enough, broke Salahadin's army. And he also was disciplined enough to stop them from pursuing those more mobile forces, because he said, no, we need to consolidate the position here. And so, and after three such these different attacks, they were able to at least hold them off. So this was a victory for Richard. And so what it did is that up until this point, Saladin was legendary in terms of that he was invincible, that he could not be stopped. And so that he dented that reputation, and and he was and because when you sort of have one little that hole in the armor, it was then able to that hole in the armor saying, well, maybe he can be defeated. And so at this point in time, they're seeking military advantage. They're trying to negotiate with one another. And so really during the winter time, they started any military action was more skirmishes. But the thing during this is Richard began to realize that actually taking Jerusalem, while they actually had the forces to be able to do it, he didn't think it was a good use of their military forces, because they could take it, but Jerusalem could be just as easily taken again. And so, and also at this point in time, Richard gets news, this is where the Robin Hood piece comes in, that his brother John, Prince John, was attempting to usurp his throne. And that's so we're getting all these stories of Robin Hood. And so he realizes he can't, to protect his own position, he can't stay. And so the only thing that he can do at this point is basically starts withdrawing forces, and Saladin seizes on this, assaults Jaffa, and then Richard returns, leads the attack on does succeed in driving Saladin's forces out, but both sides at that point are no longer able to fight. And so at this point in time, they negotiate the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192. It brings the Third Crusade to an end. Like, so this is definitively where the Crusade ends. The Third Crusades ends. So what it did is the Treaty of Jaffa guaranteed a 3-year truce between Saladin's forces and Richard's armies. The recognition on the part of Saladin, recognizing the Crusader states along the coast from Tyre to Jaffa. And so the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it was still called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but it would now be centered in Acre. And then any of the fortifications in Ascalon would be demolished, and the town would be returned to Saladin. And importantly, and this is probably the most significant ones, is that Christian pilgrims would be permitted safe travel to Jerusalem to undertake a pilgrimage into Jerusalem under the condition that they were unarmed. But they could do so under protection. And Richard himself would leave Acre in October and returning to England. And all of a sudden, I now put up this, and that was the Third Crusade. Now I suddenly put up this here. Let's just pop back here. And I want you to take a careful look at these dates at this point in time. 1192, so 8 years later, or well, make it 10 years later, we now have the Fourth Crusade, just 10 years later. And it's like, okay, well, what just happened here? Didn't the third one just end? And I mean, the Fourth Crusade was actually proclaimed in 1198, 4 years before the Fourth Crusade would actually happen. So it would it would be declared only 6 years after Richard returned by Pope Innocent III. 6 years after the Treaty of Jaffa. Again, reclaim Jerusalem, but we're going to do it by capturing Cairo, the capital of the Ayyubid Caliphate. In other words, their capital city. We're going to go to Cairo to get Jerusalem. And the thing is, there was no event aside from Pope Innocent III. And, there are several popes that go by the name, that chose the name Innocent. And I'm not sure any one of them ever were. For a whole bunch. But anyway, Innocent III, under his own ambition agenda, proclaims this. And the thing is, the Third Crusade was arguably successful. It reclaimed territory. It dented Saladin's advances. But because they didn't take Jerusalem, even though, like Richard himself said, we could have done this, and Richard chose not to do it, it was seen as a failure. But Richard was also, a shrewd diplomat, a decent, a competent, a very competent leader, and his choice to not go after Jerusalem was probably the better part of valor. But because he didn't do that, it was deemed, at least perceived, to be a failure. And so at this point in time, we have Pope Innocent III, like, almost ditching entirely his any sort of pretense of being a religious leader, although he was very much cloaked in this. And he was very much trying to consolidate power, exerting his authority, and basically trying to divert people's attention from any sort of internal turmoil that he was dealing with by pointing to an external threat. It's a very common thing amongst political leaders that if things aren't going well at home, create an external threat and go after that and try and rally people around it. It's common. It's very, very common, unfortunately. And of course, the response to the Fourth Crusade was, was very underwhelming. I mean, there was a lot of political turmoil in many of the European states. They're not in any position to actually do much of anything about it. England and France at this point are at war. The Germans are struggling and against papal power and influence that even though it would take another 300 years, the seeds of Reformation are starting to point there. The papal power was getting to be was at this point in time totalitarian, um, and so there's all kinds of things going on, and so even though the Pope Innocent III declared a crusade in 1198, it would take 4 years for them to build up any kind of enthusiasm for another campaign. Um, and so, they started doing this. There was this tournament to form an army. These jousting tournaments that you've seen. Um, there is a Monty Python adjacent film, and I'm not talking called Jabberwocky. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but it's partially mythical. But one of the features in Jabberwocky is they have this knights tournament to determine who is going to go kill the Jabberwocky this horrible beast, the Jabberwocky. And what ends up happening is there's this knights tournament, and they all end up killing each other. And this is kind of like that. So there's this tournament, and so um, at this point in time, they managed to create this core army out of this tournament. Um, and envoys start going to, well, how are we going to get there? Well, we need to go by ship. And at this point in time, if you wanted to go by ship anywhere, you either had to go to Genoa or to Venice and to negotiate a contract to actually build a fleet to take people to go, because the boats just aren't simply there. And they wanted them to have boats to travel to Egypt. But the trouble is that the Venetians themselves had a very profitable trading relationship with the Ayyubids in Egypt, and they didn't want to particularly do this. Um, but money's money, and so in March they negotiate, and Venice agrees to transport roughly 33 and a half thousand crusaders. Um, and but the thing is, they would have to build the fleet, they would have to train the soldiers, get everybody up. So it wouldn't be until May of 1202, 4 years after the Pope declared a crusade. Um, and the Venetian navy is ready, but the Crusader army hadn't managed to get enough people. And at this point in time, the Venetians had built war galleons, transports, all these kinds of things, and of course they needed payment for it. But they only had about a little less than half of the forces that they wanted to have. But the Venetians wanted to be paid, and that's a lot of money. And at this point in time, the Crusaders themselves couldn't cough it all up. They managed to basically turn out their pockets, managed to scrape up a little bit more. But so the Venetians said, you know what? Okay, tell you what, do favors for us, and we'll consider it a credit. So then they said, all right, we want you to, the Venetians at this point are a city state, and they wanted the Crusaders to, on their behalf, go intimidate these rival towns along the Adriatic Sea. And so we have this attack. Now, keep in mind, we're not anywhere close to the Middle East at this point in time. And while the Pope had actually said, you don't attack other Christian states, having somewhat learned a previous lesson, with this standing threat of excommunication, that letter was actually kept hidden from the bulk of the army. They didn't know that the Pope had actually said this. And some of the Crusaders said, you know what, we're not doing this. And others did participate. And so, not surprisingly, Innocent III did make good, excommunicated the forces. You do not get communion until you make vows and to sail for Cairo. But again, the army doesn't know what they don't know, and they weren't told of that. And so effectively, the Venetians were blackmailing the Crusaders at this point in time. And it just continued. The Crusaders still had a debt to pay to the Venetians before they would take them to Egypt. So they just kind of kept again in hold. So at this point in time, you had this Crusader force that was waiting to go to Egypt, that had a fleet that was ready to go, but they wouldn't go until they got paid. So at this point in time, the Byzantine politics start to be introduced back into here, and so he offered the Crusaders an option. He said, I will pay that entire debt to the Venetians so you can get to Egypt if you help me out. In fact, we're going to give you 200,000 silver marks, which was just an astounding amount of money. And we'll even give you 10,000 troops to the crusade to help you out. We will give you the money to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land. And you get the service of the Byzantine Navy, and we'll do this all for you. And of course, the really tempting one is that he'll even permit that the Eastern Orthodox Church, under the authority of the Pope, which at this point in time, the Great Schism was still very much in effect. So I'm not sure about you, but does this sound a little bit too good to be true?
Yeah.
You would be right. The price was they would sail to Constantinople, they would topple the current reigning emperor in Constantinople. That was their goal, or like what Alexios IV would say. I will give you all this if you do this for me. And the Venetians said, hey, actually this is we kind of like this plan. But of course they knew the Byzantines said no, the offer was too good to be true, and it wasn't. But that animosity had been growing. But the thing is, the Byzantines were very good negotiators. They were great treaty writers, and they were extremely good at playing both sides off the middle. Because quite often, if you get two groups kind of fighting, the person who's doing the playing off of each other gets what they want. And of course, there was this memory of Venetian merchants having been massacred in Constantinople. Different story. And the Crusade leaders said they were bribed to go along with this plan, and they simply some of them would continue on to Syria. But anyway, the fleet sails for Constantinople in 1203, arriving on June 23rd. Of course, the Byzantines aren't exactly receptive to all of a sudden this fleet from the west shows up, because of course, this fleet comes in saying, it's under supposedly with the intention of installing this deposed son, and they're saying at this point in time, but the governing system that they had was much stronger, and so because the Crusaders at this point they thought Alexios IV would be welcomed as a liberator. Obviously, that was a part that Alexios IV had left out. So they get this. They lay siege to Constantinople. Now, Constantinople is a Christian city. It is a center of Eastern Eastern Christian Orthodoxy. It is nowhere even close to Jerusalem. It's not even out of Europe yet. Okay. And when the Crusaders lay siege, all of a sudden Alexios III flees Constantinople, self-preservation, takes most of his treasury, somehow manages to get out, taking most of his treasury with him. And they restore Alexios IV, his father, to the throne, and removes the entire motivation of the campaign, because now that Alexios IV's father restores him to the throne, his entire motivation of "you'll make me emperor," well, he's not, because now his dad is, and unless he's going to kill his dad, and so the Crusaders say no, like he owes us. You need we're going to make you a co-emperor. Byzantines reluctantly agreed to this, but of course, Isaac begins to undermine that. And of course, when the Crusaders say, okay, now it's time to pay up, and Alexios IV goes in and realizes that the cupboard is bare, raises half of the promised price of 200,000 marks. Now, that's still a lot of money. But of course, at this point in time, animosity is just growing and growing and growing and growing. Isaac II dies. The people rioted. They depose Alexios IV. And then the imperial chamberlain declares himself to be emperor. Executes his predecessor. And then the Venetians and the Crusaders declare war on the new emperor. Again, we're not even close to Jerusalem at all. And in 1204, they agree to lay siege, declare war on the Byzantine Empire, and plan on carving up the Byzantine Empire amongst them. And by the end of the month, Constantinople's under siege, and the Crusaders managed to get in, and Constantinople is sacked. Christian city, Constantinople. And so they divide up the Byzantine empire. The Byzantine emperor has fled, and the refugees, they create their own successor states. And so what happens is you now have this area here. This is the Byzantine Empire in 1200, and then by 1204, basically you now have this all these the Byzantine Empire is carved up, and you have the Latin Empire, the Empire of Nicaea, the Empire of Trebizond, all based on previous territories: Malaysia, Bulgaria, and all these other areas here. Any of the green areas here is what Venice owns. And then you have these successor states, and then the Latin Empire, basically for having basically conquered Constantinople. And so the whole objective of the Fourth Crusade was to reclaim Jerusalem by attacking Cairo. Now, did they get anywhere near Cairo? Never mind Jerusalem. No, not at all. They got nowhere near the Middle East. They carved up a potential ally, and it cemented the split between the Eastern Orthodox and Latin churches permanently. Like this was like, if there had been any hope to resolve the Great Schism, now that 150 years after the Great Schism, there was no hope for that ever to happen at any point following this. And technically, the Byzantine Empire did actually continue to exist as a political entity, and they would eventually reclaim Constantinople, almost 6 decades later. But at this point in time, it was permanently weakened. And on any level, at any point, this was a disaster because in the entire thing, not a single Islamic force was involved at all. This was all Christian on Christian violence, if there was a religious element to be had in this. And so, Rome finally apologized for this one in 2004. So it took 800 years.
Wow.
800 years for that to be realized. So in other words, the apology came during our lifetime.
Not much different from here in Canada.
Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be talking about the aftermath of the Crusades. I mean, basically, the Fourth Crusade, if there was a thing to actually put the nail in the coffin of the concept of crusade, even though the Crusader states still existed in the Middle East, but in terms of the Crusades as the original intent of reclaiming Jerusalem, the Fourth Crusade basically, like the Third Crusade could have done it. The Fourth Crusade made sure it would never happen, ever. I mean, I suppose the closest thing to so-called returning, not even returning, but having Jerusalem fall under um, European control, that wouldn't happen until the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. So that, in terms of that was just basically where that ended up. So here
John,
we
sorry,
are.
at what point, John, did the center become Rome and not Constantinople?
In terms of the center of Christianity, you mean?
Yeah, because it had moved to Constantinople at some point.
Well, I think remember how I said in various things I've talked about how Christianity actually had five centers.
Yes.
Namely Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And probably the thing is that the Eastern Orthodox Church still even though Constantinople is now under the control of the Turks and has been for some time, the Eastern Orthodox tradition sort of eventually like still persisted and still persists today in those Orthodox traditions, but they became decentralized. And I can't remember if this necessarily did it at this point in time. But it was but at this point in time, the just being able to get to that point, I would argue, I think there's a good argument to be made that Constantinople's ability, like Eastern Orthodox Christianity still continued to exist, of course, all through this time period. But in terms of dominance, where Rome was sort of the last one standing, probably this incident certainly weakened it, but for sure it came to an end in about 1453 with the rise of the Ottoman Empire and the fall of Constantinople.
Okay, because I was just wondering why they were actually apologizing so many hundreds of years later for something, but this was because of what happened in 1453, not what happened in 1202.
No. What Rome apologized for was what happened in 1204.
Okay.
So
Let's try to get my years. 1204. Okay.
Yeah. So that was.
And this is the night I start drinking, John.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's kind of where it falls. So next week we're going to be talking about the aftermath and the legacy, because the one thing that the Crusades did, and I'll be talking about this a little bit more next week, is that the concept of colonialism as we understand it, as we now understand it, um, was something that was important for us to or sorry, just quick that the concept of colonialism emerged out of the Crusades and the legacy of the Crusades. That would be the best. Like there's a connecting of the dots, but not necessarily a straight line. Um, although but the dots do go back to the Crusades themselves in terms of because some would say that the Crusader period arguably ended in 1492 with the last of the because up until this point, there the southern part of Spain, or what is now Spain of the Iberian Peninsula, was under Islamic control, and it wasn't until 1492 when that ended, and of course that coincided with Columbus's expedition to try and find India, and of course he didn't find India. He found something else, and and that that really made that was a and so the timing of that was really interesting, that you had the end of the crusade and then the energy gets focused somewhere else. But that's next week's topic.
Hmm.
So any other questions or anything you want me to go back and review?
Hmm. Hmm.
So I did call this a dark history for good reason.
Yeah, it's very dark.
It is, particularly particularly the Fourth Crusade was such a such a debacle. It was crazy.
So was there any documentation at all about how these crusading soldiers were accepted back in their homelands? Like,
it depends.
I'm just thinking of, when the Americans came out of Vietnam and
Yeah.
how they were not necessarily accepted with open arms. Would the same thing have happened in England? And
I think it was probably it is a good question. Um, I think one of the things with that is certainly after the first crusade, returning crusaders were hailed as heroes. They were um, granted enormous favors. They had huge reputations, and the um, and there were all kinds of things that really helped them. So there was a certain degree of, there were legends spun about these returning crusaders. Like even to the point where the legends of knights fighting dragons that still affect a part of popular culture that personally influences me today can be traced back to that, in terms of that welcoming. And so that kind of, and I think Richard appropriately calls that propaganda, certainly romanticized tellings of that. And there was almost 90 years where that was romanticized and elevated. Um, and so for the most part, that was kind of carried forward with each successive crusade up until the fourth. The fourth was just such, um, like it was the one that they really didn't want to talk about.
yeah,
Um, but it was it was what it was. I think like uh, I mean, Richard himself was regarded as a returning hero. Um,
As with the Knights of the Templar, because the romantic uh, stories that were about them meant they were victors. Therefore, they were greeted as heroes.
yes, they were.
So I think everybody within the Third Crusade went back thinking, "Oh, we've done such a great job," and everybody believed that they had.
Hmm.
But I don't believe that that actually falls into context when you take in the Fourth Crusade,
Yeah.
because for as much as they use the word crusade, today we would call it an occupation.
Mm, absolutely.
So
Uh,
it was less religious, other than the fact that this is what a pope wanted.
yeah. Yeah, and certainly in the case of as far as objectives are concerned, like the Pope got absolutely nothing of what and which was interesting because I mean he was a pretty, from what I understand, he was a pretty power hungry guy. And uh and so because of that, um he could uh the it was interesting. He had his own ambitions, but the ambitions versus reality were just not there. I mean, he was not politically astute at all. uh Maybe he understood things in Europe, but basically wasn't able to read much of anything. So um
What happened to those wives? Like, why did they take the sister and the, was it because they thought that they were going to be ending up living in the Middle East, or like what?
Yeah, but one often did travel with one's family. I mean, this isn't like going on an airplane trip.
Yeah.
You would be gone for years at a time,
I wonder
and
what happened to the family.
they would travel too. I mean, or of course, or left under some conservatorship. Other elements, like a lot of Richard's family would travel, but I mean, his brother, of course, Prince John, who was sort of left as a regent in Richard's absence. And of course, the longer that Richard was away, the more John uh, sought the throne for himself. You um, there was more. Uh, there was more of that going on. So yeah. Um, what we'll talk about, as I mentioned, next week. We like what I'd like you to do. If there's any other questions you have, by all means, please like work on them for the next while. I mean, Cheryl, your question about wives. They did travel to a certain degree with families, or at least the nobles did. Um, and I think there's a certain degree of romanticism that there are periods of in human history where the concept of the warrior becomes romanticized, and it kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, Vietnam was a representation of a huge ebb in that, and the price of war. But I mean, uh, in one of the first battles of the American Civil War, people came to watch it as if they were watching a football game.
Mm.
And unfortunately, modern warfare being what it is, it's not a football game. Whereas some of the like more the further back in history you went, is that armies arrayed against themselves on fields of battle, and it was possible to spectate.
Mhm.
Um,
Like 1812.
uh, 1812 was starting to get into mechanized warfare. I mean, I like trench warfare was a thing that started to be developed. But I mean, if you think at uh,
Plains of Abraham.
things like the Plains of Abraham. Yeah, I think to a certain degree as well. There was still that element to it that it could be spectated, I guess. Um, uh,
Atosh.
but there was still an intrinsic danger, and I mean, same deal with any battle, battle in the Middle East. But I mean, like, there's one very famous battle of Hannibal, who is a Carpathian general. And then we're talking, this goes back like, pre-Roman times, where Hannibal, who's a Carpathian general, takes elephants across the Swiss Alps, um, and confronts a Roman force that is considerably larger than his, and at the Battle of Cannae wins. And this is one that could have been, that was actually, I believe was spectated, that you could actually be up on the upper parts of the area and actually watch it happen. And it's sort of considered to be the blueprint of the skilled general commanding his forces. And military commander, sort of it becomes like the gold standard of to be compared against. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing, but unfortunately, what happened is over time, this kind of warrior culture became more and more romanticized.
Mm.
It peaked at the beginning of the First World War, because and the warnings and the lessons of what had happened during the American Civil War about half a century before. Um, at that point in time, the Europeans were so very arrogant in terms of, well, those barbaric colonials, don't know how to fight like gentlemen.
Mm.
Is where that sort of came out of, and uh, never mind that people who had actually studied the American Civil War have saying this is what happens when you have industrialized nations fighting each other.
Mm.
But that's way, way, way after the period that we're talking about here. So
Interesting. Okay.
anyway, so here we are, just approaching our end time for tonight. I'm going to stop recording now. But anyway, before I sign off for this, thank you everybody for coming. But if you have any other questions after I stop recording, please let me know. But again, thank you for coming out for tonight's session.